So grateful for all of you for joining, and this is our first Stanford Angels and Entrepreneurs Zoom gathering, and we have an incredible set of speakers and participants that are joining us today. As a reminder, the theme for this evening is dialogue, reimagining our world, innovation, inclusion, and impact. And we have leading Stanford faculty, investors, and entrepreneurs. My name is Jenna, and I'm the Vice President of Stanford Angels and Entrepreneurs and also the CEO of Impact Experience. And I have just a few quick housekeeping notes before we dive right in. If you need any technical assistance during the event, please feel free to type questions into the chat function and just make sure it's set to 2 so that the area is set to everyone. We have a few Zoom wizards that are standing by who can jump in and assist you. And when it comes to questions, which we'll add in at the end, you can raise your hand in the program. And so this is not on the screen because we might not see you waving. We have quite a few participants, but by going into the participants tab, which is the button is on the bottom of your screen, and then clicking on the blue hand, and we will unmute you, and I'll let you know who's on deck. And if you put yourself on mute, you may have to unmute yourself. And for those of you who, I'm sure many of you are Zoom pros by now, but for those of you who are newer to Zoom, you can do that by clicking on the microphone in the bottom left corner of your screen. And if it has a red line through it, that is a sign that you are muted. And we encourage you to hold your questions until the end, and you can type those questions into the chat or raise your hand in the program and ask them out loud. So now I'd love to introduce you to our incredible panelists. We have Miriam Rivera, who is the co-founder and board chair of Stanford Angels and Entrepreneurs. And she's also the co-founder and managing director of Ulu Ventures, a former Stanford board trustee, an early vice president at Google and deputy general counsel, as well as has an MBA and JD from Stanford. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing from her shortly. We also have Professor Mehran Sahami, who is a professor and associate chair for education in the computer science department at Stanford, and also formerly at Google as a senior research scientist, and many areas of research interest, but these include computer science education, machine learning, and information retrieval on the web advisor side of things. And he's also an advisor to Stanford Angels and Entrepreneurs. We then have Radhika Shah, who is a co-president of Stanford Angels and Entrepreneurs and is an advisor to the UN Sustainable Development Goals Philanthropy Platform, also an advisor to Alum Capital and Impact Fund of Funds Tackling Bias, as well as Impact Experience, an advisor also to the Stanford Center for Human Rights and International Justice, and a board member for Center for Effective Global Action out of Berkeley, and has computer science degree, a master's in computer science from Stanford. And last but not least, we have Jenny Shia-Spradling, who is the co-founder and co-CEO of Free Will, very innovative, transformative social impact entrepreneur, an alum from Stanford Business School, and formerly at Bain Capital, where she helped to build out their impact investing work. So we have absolutely incredible set of panelists that we'll be hearing from shortly. And so the structure of our time together is we'll have some remarks from each of our panelists, and then we'll be opening up for Q&A. And it's great to see the chat. Feel free to share questions in the chat, and we'll be compiling them and asking them at the end. So at this point, we'd love to hand over to Miriam to kick us off with some remarks, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
Thank you for coming out. It's really great to see Stanford Angels and Entrepreneurs kind of convening in the midst of what has been kind of a dry spell, I think, in terms of activity. And it's wonderful to see that there's so much interest in the topic of kind of innovation and inclusion and impact. And I'll kind of talk a little bit about some of the ways that we focus in that space as Ulu Ventures. And I think that a lot of that has had an impact in the club over the years as people have invested in companies, that were focused on different aspects of both innovation and I think impact. And so that's been one of the the kind of neat things about the club is that I think it has investors that are interested obviously in kind of traditional tech, as well as members that are interested in applying that same kind of thinking to innovation and impact. For us, we always kind of look for this intersection between companies that have, you know, the potential to, I think, make a big difference in markets. I see, for example, Jenny Shia Spalding is here today, who's one of our entrepreneurs, and her technology platform has helped raise over $1 billion for not-for-profits. And it's also been one of the fastest growing companies in the ULU portfolio. And so we like to think of companies that really have the potential to very scalably create positive social change. And we tend to do that through a couple of different mechanisms. So one of them is trying to increase access to capital for diverse teams who are often really underfunded in the tech sector by venture capital. And interestingly enough, probably about 80% of our teams have a diverse member in the ULU portfolio, and that would include women, immigrants, underrepresented minorities, and other U.S. domestic minorities, you know, many of them in our area, Asian or Indian, for example. And that, I think, is really unusual in venture. And part of the reason we've always tried to have the club as well have a focus on companies that may not have as much access to capital as others. And so I think you've seen that in some of the great successes in the portfolio, including Blue River Technologies, for example, that again had a diverse team. One was an immigrant from Peru, really innovative technology in terms of robotics and computer vision on tractors that became now a next generation technology for John Deere. And in addition, you know, they were just award-winning on so many technical dimensions, but they also had this environmental impact that they reduced the use of herbicides by 90%. And so I think that was a really significant company for many of us that invested. And then SoFi was another company in the fund that was really interested in the community of Stanford Angels and Entrepreneurs. Those of you who might have been around at that time remember that initially they were raising capital to refinance student loans from the alumni of Stanford University. And so the club was a really easy sell in terms of participating in SoFi's first round of financing. And I think many people also don't realize that the first technologist who built the software for SoFi was the wife of Mike Cagney, who has been his kind of co-pilot in almost all his ventures, including now Figure and Provenance, and also a hedge fund that used technology that she developed. And she is an Asian woman also. So again, a diverse team. And you know, I think we're really excited to see that the club has been able to continue to be a source of mentorship and community, as well as a platform where I think a lot of the companies, you know, do get real feedback on their ideas. They have an opportunity to speak with very engaged angels, and that Stanford in itself has really benefited from the organization, because Stanford Angels and Entrepreneurs has become the largest alumni group in the Stanford community. So it's now, you know, over 1,500 members locally, and there are chapters that develop in different geographies and have developed in LA and India, in the UK, and my understanding is that there's interest in developing chapters in New York and Singapore. And so each community of Stanford Angels and entrepreneurs really can kind of create an ecosystem that supports entrepreneurship wherever, you know, there's a critical mass of alums that really do want to support entrepreneurs, and hopefully in both these impact areas as well as kind of traditional startup companies, and then making an impact in terms of who has access to capital. And, you know, I think with the recent situations that we've seen in this country about the disparity of the economy and the impact on particular communities and low income communities in particular being so vulnerable economically, that this is one of the things that's kind of unusual about venture, and that maybe entrepreneurs themselves don't quite realize that in many ways, the entrepreneur is at the foundation of wealth formation and wealth distribution within the American economy. The biggest employer of people is actually small business and newest small business. So meaning companies that are under the age of 5 years old hire the most people. And that's collectively, obviously, because a lot of small businesses remain small, but they do hire people in those early years. And there has been a decline over the last 30 years in the number of entrepreneurs that are starting small businesses. And, you know, we're kind of in the extreme here in Silicon Valley because we're used to a small business that really can grow to become a Yahoo or a Google, a Facebook, that kind of a thing. And that's just not the reality for most companies. In fact, like only 1% of companies in the United States are public companies, but 43% of those companies were venture backed. And so a lot of them start off with angel financing and grow to be much larger companies. And the interesting thing about the investment by angels and venture capitalists is that ultimately that 1% of companies employs a third of the United States population of workers. So who actually gets access to create these companies can have a very long-term effect in terms of how companies are built, and, you know, just the kind of change that's possible because the founders have different lived experiences in their early teams compared to traditional venture. And, you know, some of the examples of this would be, I was a startup founder of a small company in the late 90s. I had my first child while I was a founder. I had her on Friday. I went back to work on Monday. But within a couple of months, the Series B VCs didn't want a husband and wife team. And I certainly think my having a child had something to do with that. And I left the company. But then later on, when I was at Google and I started the legal team there, one of the things that I made available to my team, because we were 50% women, even in a state where the California bar was only a third women. And I created a policy that said, hey, if you have a child and you're a working mom, you can have up to 6 months of leave. Now, the company only paid for 3, so it was 3 months of unpaid leave. But what ended up happening is that we never lost a woman on my team when they had a child. And then the company later on saw the data coming out of this team, and they determined that the benefits needed to be improved. And so Google created a 4-month paid leave program with an additional month of unpaid leave available upon request. And the fact is, we actually never had somebody take the whole 6 months. So I think they actually covered the waterfront, if you will, with this kind of a policy. And that helped to stem some of the loss of female talent from Google because again, it's just dealing more realistically with kind of the lived experience that a woman might bring in management and leadership to the work that she does, and helps to promote and retain talent. And I think that a lot of the times, you know, an inclusive posture in your leadership team really permits you to have more effective business practices that actually make you a higher performing company. And so that's one reason why when I saw that venture capitalists was not investing in women, was not investing in people of color, I saw it as a real opportunity. And I think that we have tried to bring some of those opportunities to Stanford Angels and Entrepreneurs as well, and really enjoy working with the club to share deal flow, to host events, and look forward to continuing to play an active role to promote both the social impact investing that the club is, I think, you know, making its own here, and that's also creating more diversity in the club. We used to not have as many women participate in events, and I see that when we started doing more of these impact events, we actually created a different audience for Stanford Angels and Entrepreneurs, and one that I'm really want to welcome to this kind of investing. So thank you for coming out tonight and for being a part of this community, and for helping entrepreneurs to really make a big difference in our country in terms of employment, in terms of changing how organizations work, and I think having the potential to create public companies that are more successful and more inclusive of all.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much, Miriam. Really appreciate your reflections and being here, and all of your leadership to enable us to be here today. So thank you. Next up, we have Professor Mehran Sahami. So over to you, Mehran.
Great, thanks very much. So I'm going to share my screen with you because as an academic type, that's what I do. So hopefully that's coming through now. And what I wanted to talk about was kind of the notion of thinking about the pipeline of some of the, you know, what leads to some of the tech innovation that Miriam was talking about, and kind of back up in the sense of thinking about who gets access to educational opportunities, especially in computing, which is kind of where I've been focusing the past few years. And so just to give you some, you know, stats along those lines, because there's, you know, part of me that's kind of a statistics person and, you know, feels like it's important to kind of have a backdrop for all this. And it probably goes without saying, I'd imagine most people here are very familiar with the shortage of computing professionals. And it's estimated right now that there's about 500,000 current openings for computing jobs in the United States, and that's going to continue to grow over time. There's economic incentives for this, right? Computer science majors generally earn about 40% more than the national average for college graduates. And if you actually look at what parents want for their kids, you know, national surveys, 90% of parents say they want their child to be able to study computer science in high school. So there's this huge opportunity here. And part of the opportunity is really to create more diversity in the field. You know, just a couple of statistics to give you a sense of the magnitude of how much of a change can be had. You know, they've looked at, for example, students who took the AP computer science class in high school. And if you're a woman who took that class, you were 10 times more likely to major in computer science in college than if you didn't. And if you were a Black or Latinx student, you were 7 times more likely, right? So we're not talking about a 10% or 20% increase. We're talking about 1,000% increase or 700% increase. So there's an opportunity here to actually be able to do something really big. But part of the problem that comes up is that a lot of schools, actually the majority of schools, don't have access to computing education. Less than half of high schools do. And the high schools that actually have this kind of access, there's a very unequal access based on things like the affluence of the neighborhood in which someone lives. And so part of the idea is thinking about, you know, how can we try to think about this imbalance? What does it actually look like? So if you look at, for example, the race and ethnicity by gender of computer science majors in colleges, this was taken a couple of years ago from the Department of Education, you can see that white students are very much overrepresented, right? They're, you know, 61% of the US population, they make up a large percentage of the computer science majors, at least the men do. For the women, it's a lot lower. And then if you look at, for example, Hispanics are 18% of the US population, but both for men and women below 10% taking majoring in computer science. The statistics are even worse for the Black population, right? So there's clearly a skew in who is having access to majoring in computer science in college. Part of that has to do with background and the whole pipeline of being able to get there. And this then leads to who has the opportunities to get involved in terms of building innovative tech companies based on the education that they actually had. So if we kind of think about that as our pipeline, we can think about what's the opportunity. Part of the opportunity, so I want to talk about a couple projects. One is a project that was led by Code.org a few years ago that I was involved in terms of the organization, which was to create a framework for computer science education for the whole K through 12 pipeline. And the idea is that, you know, in the United States, if you look at education policy, there's basically 50 different education policies because every state has its own education policy. And so part of the issue is how do you actually get states to do something? Because oddly enough, as strange as it sounds, different states actually believe that there's, you know, different particulars that their students should be studying. And I happened to, just to give you one example, I happened to be at a lunch, this was a few years back, where I was sitting next to the person who happened to be the former governor of Tennessee. And we got into this conversation and we were talking about standards for education. And he said, you know, in Tennessee, we would never adopt a national standard because we want what's right for the children of Tennessee. And it left me kind of thinking, is what the children of Tennessee need to know really that different than what the children of Kentucky or California need to know? And I remember distinctly thinking to myself, I'm glad California doesn't have this view. Until a few years later, I happened to be in a meeting with the California State School Board, and the first person who got up said, we're here to do what's right for the children of California. And again, I thought, is it really that different? So how do you get to, you know, reach 50 different constituencies who believe they want to do the right thing for their students, which might be a little bit different than another state, even though it's really not? And the idea is, rather than giving them standards, which is what they use to determine education, you give them a framework that they can then turn into standards. So it's their own personal standard, so they will adopt it, but you create a national framework so that they're not all starting from scratch. And that was the idea behind this framework, was basically the notion of computer science as essential knowledge for all students. And the idea is that if we could actually create a standard or a framework that the states could adopt, they could actually begin to roll out computer science education in various states. Now, part of the question that comes up is, it's not just creating a framework, right? You can't just create a document and say, okay, now schools are going to teach this stuff. There's actually what happens with the nuts and bolts of what happens. And so, interestingly enough, in California, Governor Brown, this was a few years back, actually signed a law that began a process to look into the notion of expanding computer science education for all grades in all California public schools. And in order to kind of make that happen, basically what he convened was a group of 15 people, I happened to be one of the people on that committee, that was charged with making recommendations to the State Board of Education as to what the state should do with respect to adopting computer science standards, what that would mean for certification for teachers, what that would mean in terms of funding, in terms of equipment and teachers, and basically the whole ball of stuff. So after a few months on this, you know, panel, after which point actually we even had a change in governorship, it turned out by last year, 2019, we began to start the gears turning in California. So California actually adopted statewide standards for computer science education for the whole K through 12 pipeline. Guess what their standards are based on? Yeah, the national framework. And the initial funding, which was small to begin with, so last year in the budget, they proposed about $16 million, most of which of that is for infrastructure to begin with. But the idea is that this would be getting the ball rolling for a larger effort that over time would actually invest this pretty significant amount of funding into rolling out computer science education throughout the state. And the idea being that this is just one template for how to do it, right? If we can reach about 6 million kids who are in the California public school system at any given time, right? That pipeline is always passing through. Maybe we can create more of those equality of opportunity where rather than just having the schools in the affluent areas, all schools have computer science education. And rather than getting a skew in the distribution of who gets access and who potentially majors in it, we get a much more equal distribution in terms of access to those educational opportunities. That's kind of the formal route, right? That's the route you go where you spend a couple years working with policymakers and you go through the gears of the state process, and that's important. It's important because you get a lot of resources behind it, and the more this gets rolled out in more and more states, which is what's going on now, you get a real national tide toward computer science education. But sometimes you also want to do things on a personal level. So I want to spend a little bit of time just talking to you about what's possible to do with very little resources and basically the kindness of human beings during the time of the current pandemic to be able to actually have an impact on education. And so this was a project called Code in Place, which was done with Chris Peach. Actually, he's sort of the main brainchild of this project, but we've collaborated together on a bunch of things for over a decade now. And the idea was when the pandemic was coming and the shelter-in-place orders were given, we thought about what could we do, right? We're not medical professionals, so we can't go and be on the front lines. We're computer science educators. What can we do with that? We thought, well, there's probably a lot of people who are stuck at home. Why not try to provide free education? So we put together this global class that was free. During the pandemic, we had actually 10,000 students enrolled in the class. We had about 50,000 sign up to get in the class, and I'll show you why we couldn't accommodate all the students to begin with. But here's a little heat map that shows you where they came from, and basically they came from every continent except for Antarctica. We were hoping someone from the research station down there would sign up, but they didn't. But pretty much got all the other continents. In terms of gender representation, interestingly enough, it was actually majority women. If you look at the age distribution, you'll see it cuts off at 18 because what we were trying to do was actually reach people who were, not already in school, but potentially would consider, say, job retraining opportunities. And I'll talk a little bit about what happened as a result. But you can see there's a pretty broad distribution of ages who signed up for the class. And interestingly enough, we did some surveys of the students. 20% of the students in our class had experienced job loss or home loss as a result of the pandemic. Many of them were actually interested in job retraining, which is part of the reason they signed up for the class, which is part of what our hope was to try to provide that training. The retention rate of the class, which I won't spend too much talking about, but was greater than 10 times the baseline retention in general massive open online classes or MOOCs that you see. And that was one of the things that was important for us. We didn't want to just create another MOOC. We didn't want to just create a bunch of videos and put them online. We wanted to create a human experience because we thought that especially during this time, two things were necessary. One was human contact, and second was human compassion to have someone actually be able to help someone else through the learning process. And to do that, in terms of how students respond to that, 99% actually wanted more after the first section they went to. And that number didn't go down much by the end of the class. So how do we pull this off? We pulled it off with the kindness of strangers, basically, and actually the kindness of a lot of Stanford alumni too, and some current students. But we put out a call for section leaders where we said, we're trying to do this class. We're looking for volunteers. This is an unpaid position, but what we'd like you to do is to teach a section of, say, 10 to 12 people. It would be a weekly meeting. You would look at the work that they would do. You would provide them feedback, and you would give them personalized support through that time. We asked them to do about an hour's worth of training beforehand, and there was actually an application process, so we wanted to make sure they had some skills in education. They actually had to make a video of them teaching. They had to give us personal experience. We had well over 1,000 people apply. We actually went through all the videos. We had a small team working with us to do that, but 905 passed our bar, which is why we have 10,000 students, because we tried to keep this 10 to 1 or 12 to 1 ratio. And basically what we taught during that period was, pretty much at full force, the whole first half of Stanford's introductory computer science class. And the idea was to give students a real Stanford level experience to thousands of students around the world. And as I mentioned, the retention rate was really high. We had an extremely positive response, but we had many students, even after this short 5-week experience, actually write to us to say that they were now able to get jobs in software development, or they were now taking the next step to take additional classes or to do a boot camp because they'd gotten over their fear of computing and they could see a future in this profession. And that was really our hope, was to be able to, again, with the kindness of strangers, right? It's two people couldn't have done this all. is to be able to provide some opportunities for education during this crisis, which we think would have an implication in the long term, and hopefully get some more people to understand the skills of computer science, so then they can move further on in the pipeline and be the next generation of founders for some of the companies that Miriam's going to be supporting. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Jenna.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mehran. Really appreciate it. Your amazing, amazing work. So next up, we have Radhika.
Can you hear me, Jenna?
Yes, that's great.
So good to be reconnected with the Stanford Angels and entrepreneurs community in this moment of great change, a moment of crisis, but also a moment of opportunity. COVID has shown us that we cannot just continue as usual, and how we are all connected to each other and to our planet's health. It has shown that we cannot afford to ignore the great challenges of our times, including public health, growing inequality, and climate crisis. Articulated in the UN's 17 Sustainable Development Goals, also known as the SDGs. These goals are committed to by almost all world leaders to solve by 2030 the major global challenges that were mentioned earlier, as well as access to water, energy, jobs for all humanity. What is unique is that for the first time ever, we have a global taxonomy for impact that enables us to collaborate, share knowledge, but also have the spirit of leaving nobody behind. To me, these SDGs are a North Star for almost everything I do now, as they reconnect me to my childhood world of Gandhian philosophy. I'm growing up in the backdrop of the Gandhi ashram. The ethos of respecting the dignity of each and every human being, and that of thinking of a relationship to nature as that of a trustee, not an exploiter. As an advisor to the SDG philanthropy platform launched now in 8 countries, I build bridges between Silicon Valley, Stanford, and the world, or at least I attempt to do so, including with the Stanford Angels and Entrepreneurs community. It is a time to reimagine ourselves and our world. We have seen one of the largest social movements in America take birth to protest against racial injustice in our system. It's a time of hope. We are at an inflection point where tech adoption is making the seemingly impossible possible. We are recognizing that tech automation may be the way forward. Can we bring forth the power of AI to overcome human biases rather than to scale them? The amplifying power of social media to promote pluralism rather than spread xenophobia, digital inclusion to help tackle gender, racial, and economic inequality rather than create new digital divides. These are some of the questions we are grappling with right now. I wanted to add a couple of things on Stanford Angels and Entrepreneurs following in Miriam's great introduction. And Miriam's been such an amazing mentor to me and to so many of us. I know to Jenna, and we are so lucky that she's so engaged with Stanford Angels and has been so catalytic in building this community, all of us here together. And I wanted to mention that 2 things I love here are the community and the thought leadership around impact. That's an area I've been very engaged in over the years. Bringing together the nexus of entrepreneurship, innovation, investment, but also tech innovation and business models for societal impact. And we've had many talks like this, and it's been so inspiring to see the community so engaged in these. And I also love a faculty advisory board that Mehran is part of, and Professor Andrew Ng, who started Coursera, and several GSB law school professors. We are so privileged to have these thought leaders be such engaged members of the community. Thank you, Mehran, and your colleagues there. I wanted to now share a couple of Stanford Angels and Entrepreneur stories. Startups have invested in these disruptive and inclusive digital innovations could be game changers in a post-COVID world, especially in the world of social distancing. Miriam already mentioned Blue River Technologies, which is transforming the future of agriculture. This pioneer in computer vision and robotics was started by deeply mission-driven entrepreneurs, a very diverse team, and I believe we were among the early funding following in Ulvu's footsteps because we believed in these people's desire to change the world, and we believed in the power of technology. By we, I mean myself and all of us who invested early in this company. They went on to do amazing work, amazing impact, but also disrupt the entire industry. So it's a powerful story of tech disrupting an industry. And not just that, it's a story where they proved that you can have impact and make money. Miriam mentioned they were bought by John Deere and it was over 300 million. They had a very good exit. It's a powerful story of how you can disrupt and transform industries. Another story is of Casper.ai, also started by Stanford grads and a CS professor, Dr. Saxena, a story of transformative and inclusive tech innovation helping the elderly. As we know, these are among the most vulnerable segments of society, especially in COVID times with the crisis in nursing homes. Casper enables safe, independent, and comfortable living at home for this segment, for the elderly and the disabled. This distributed AI operating system, most cutting-edge technology-powered intelligent home, learns each resident's preferences on lighting, temperature, appliances, etc. over time. Via context-sensitive automation, it auto-adapts the environment to the disabled or senior resident's needs. It can auto-detect falls and alert and send health reminders. It is really a game changer for the elderly and the vulnerable. And I love it that this guy gave up his professorship at Cornell to start the startup because he wanted to have a positive impact in the world. This is also an SNE investment, and I'm personally involved as an investor. And yet, I believe that such innovations are necessary, but not sufficient to solve the grand challenges of our times. We operate within very complex systems with very nuanced externalities. For sustainable systems change, we need to understand how we think, how our minds operate, recognize the power of community leadership versus just individual leadership, be willing to give up some of our privilege. While shifting mindsets is not easy, this may be the moment to seize, to rebuild a world that leaves no one behind. I'll share 3 dimensions, additional dimensions to reflect on that I believe can help us shift systems. The first one is understanding the nature of bias and how we might overcome it. If we all have biases, at Stanford Spark, Professors Eberhardt and Marcus are researching how bias may have the evolutionary role in helping the brain to rapidly categorize for pattern matching. There's a reason it got created. They believe that we can overcome bias. To do so, context matters, as does slowing down the decision process and focusing on specifics. Professor Eberhardt's book, Biased, has an example on how a company, a tech company, very easily redesigned its tech solution for bias reduction very effectively by understanding these principles. I was part of a recent Stanford study, the effect of race on professional investors' financial judgments, the results of which shocked the industry. The more qualified an African-American fund manager, as we found, there seemed more resistance and possible bias towards him. It kind of challenged the theory, the standing theory that is just a pipeline problem, not enough women and people of color in the investment industry. The second dimension is we don't need only social justice. Of course, we need social justice, but we need economic justice hand in hand with social justice. An example of economic justice focus systems change is Illumine Capital, a fund of impact funds started by GSB alum Darren Dodson, who believes that by helping fund managers tackle the biases and by funding diverse fund managers, we can create more economic value for everybody, including those fund managers. Illumine requires that all fund managers funds go through formal bias reduction training, actually through Jenna's organization, and they in turn can be catalytic change agents to shift the mindset of the investment ecosystem, and the ripple effect could be very powerful. And the third one I want to focus on, the third dimension, is embracing a pluralistic ethos and the business case for pluralism. Not just recognizing the moral argument and the beauty in diversity, but the belief that diversity is a major asset. It's a huge competitive advantage. A case in point is our own Miriam Rivera's deep belief that by funding diverse entrepreneurs, including women and entrepreneurs of color, Ulu can also be even more financially successful, not just do the right thing. And this is something that I think is not deeply understood enough by the investment community or the world in general. These 3 are factors that I think, if you reflect on them as you're building innovations, they can help you build that much better innovations. And as I wrap up, I want to applaud Jenna Nicholas's leadership at Impact Experience, building bridges, tackling biases, co-creating economic opportunities, as she calls them, economic gardening for vulnerable communities. And I'm very honored to be an advisor to Illumin Capital and Jenna's Impact Experience. And I think these two organizations pull together all the three dimensions I talked about in a very powerful way. I'll conclude with a quote from my hero, Mahatma Gandhi. The true measure of any society can be found in how it treats its most vulnerable members. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Radhika, and thank you for your kind words. It's much appreciated. So last but not least, we have Jenny Shears-Fraudling. And as a reminder, we'll be opening up after Jenny shares for questions from the audience. So prepare your questions. So over to you, Jenny.
Thank you, Jenna. So excited to be here with you all. So I'm the co-founder and co-CEO of a company called Free Will. We literally provide free online wills for people to do their estate planning, and we make it easy for them to leave money to charity. So the reason why we started the company is because we realized that the single biggest wealth transfer in human history is about to happen in the next couple of decades. And nonprofits can stand to potentially make this the most impactful philanthropic moment, the most money transferred into nonprofits in our lifetimes and all history, or they might miss up the opportunity and not engage in planned giving. So we built a series of software that lets people create wills and donate to charity, as well as do other kind of more complex, larger gifts into nonprofits. So as Miriam mentioned, we are so lucky to be one of their portfolio companies at Ulu, and have seen kind of firsthand how important it is to have amazing investors who hold you accountable to not just creating big impact, but also to growing fast and scaling that impact. What I'd like to share today, I don't have any slides, not a professor, but I can tell you a few stories from my own experience. And the stories are aimed at a few things. One topic is, how do we get more diverse entrepreneurs and early employees into social enterprises? And the second topic is, how do we get more social enterprises? So both topics that are very near and dear to my heart. So on the first one, I kind of come at being an entrepreneur from a couple different angles. I'm obviously a female. I'm also Asian. And one thing that I've seen consistently with my peers are, there are a couple things I think holding us back from becoming entrepreneurs. One of them is the confidence gap, which has been talked about extensively in corporate America and all of these sorts of things, but I definitely saw it firsthand. I actually started my first company 1 year out of college with a couple friends, and I left the company, and the number one reason why I left the company, even though I was an equal co-founder, is because I did not believe that I could found a successful company. And funnily, I went off to a corporate job, Bain Capital, where I learned a lot about impact investing and building a social enterprise. So it's a great experience. But had I stayed with the company, it exited to Capital One, and I would have made 30 times as much money. And it's that moment made me realize that these people who were my friends, who were just like me, who I could really see myself in myself, could do it. And that is what led me to lead the second business. And had it not been for that successful exit, I do not think I would be an entrepreneur today. So I think that there's something there around the willingness to make mistakes, the modeling of that, ever since people are really, really young. And so I've seen that a lot with my female entrepreneurs who are friends. They want to raise as much money as early as possible so that they can, lower their own risk. But what I tell them is that's also lowering your reward. And ultimately, I think these cycles, which are lack of confidence and lack of ability to take risk, are ultimately keeping folks from being wealthy and creating that economic impact and being able to pass that on. So that's just one story. Another story is about being Asian. So one of the most fun and educational experiences was working with my co-founder. My co-founder is absolutely amazing. His name is Patrick. He was previously ran email fundraising for Obama. He was very early at change.org, has just really built a lot of the best practices in online fundraising. And we're so lucky to work together. And I remember going into investor pitches And when we first started, you know, we would each introduce ourselves. And after a little while, Patrick was like, maybe I should just introduce both of us. And he did. And his description of me was a totally different person. I was like, I have literally not met this person. She sounds so smart. She's so accomplished. She's so amazing. Who is this? And it was extraordinarily effective. Like, you could see it in the investors' eyes. Immediately they lit up when they heard his description. And I think that there's something there about being boastful, or the perception of being boastful, and that when you are an entrepreneur and when you're making a pitch that you have absolutely or almost nothing to show, and that someone should make a bet on you and your idea, that leaning into something that culturally was very foreign to me, but came very naturally for my tall white male co-founder, was really important. So I think that's another thing that I'd love to see more training on and encouragement on in order to increase diversity in entrepreneurship. And then the last thing is focusing on early employees. So I think that Miriam touched on a really important point about wealth creation and distribution. It's very plain to see that the difference between being a founder's equity and being an early employee's equity is a lot. And then the difference again between being an early employee equity, as in first 10 employees, and the next 50 people is also a lot. And so one thing that I think is so important is that founders focus on diversity early, in part because it will make it so much easier to hire a diverse workforce going forward, but also in part because ultimately these are the folks who are going to be economically rewarded. And it's awkward to talk about, but it's so important, right? These are the folks who are going to have enough capital to be able to leave and start their next company and their next company after that, as well as that reputation. So we know that, you know, in the end, startups can be good or bad ideas, but a lot of them are going to fail. And so the more at-bats you have with more diverse employees earlier, I ultimately think that's going to lead to a lot of wealth transfer and be really important. And so our story there is I was very committed to having 50% female engineers early in the company, which, as Professor Sahami kind of shared, is a little bit challenging. But we made it happen. And the way that we made it happen is we just set that bar for ourselves. And, you know, in the evenings, I would schedule 50 interviews per person I hired. And I had to do it because I needed every single one of these engineers to be absolutely amazing. And I needed to, you know, reach my own internal goal. And others could say like, oh, maybe you can come up with some other more other methods of doing it. But for me, it was just rote numbers in order to get there. And since my first 10 employees or 15 employees, I've never had a problem being able to hire female engineers, because it turns out it's a network problem as well. So those are my stories around inclusivity. And so a little bit on social enterprises. So I guess just a few things that I wish that I had known when I had first started FreeWill. The first one is try to create a company where your business model is parallel to the impact you're creating, not orthogonal. And what I mean by that is one of the companies that Bain Capital Impact had invested in early was a company called Tom's Shoes, a company probably that many of you guys are very familiar with. You buy a pair of very cute shoes, and then they will donate a pair of shoes to some child who needs it in a developing country. The initial problem with this, as many economists noted, is actually these shoes ended up kind of being dumping and not creating local economies where local shoemakers could sell their shoes because they were getting shoes for free. And ultimately, this ended up creating a negative cycle. Tom's has since changed that. They now actually invest in local factories, which is great. But one of the lessons I learned from that experience is whether it's Tom's or another company like Warby Parker that's doing a 1-for-1, while they're great business models that I do think has created a generation that is inspired by impact, in some ways their impact is orthogonal to their actual business model. It's a marketing line item for them. The more impact they create, the more costly it is to them. It is not the case generally that the more revenue that they make, the more natural impact comes out of it. And so one thing that I didn't think to look into before I went into a little bit of impact investing was this question of how orthogonal is your mission to your kind of financial outcome. So that's one piece. The second piece is we early on moved FreeWill from Silicon Valley to New York, and it was one of the best decisions that we ever made. I might have a controversial opinion here, but I'll say it anyway, which is we moved to New York because New York had the most nonprofits of any city in the US. And then we looked at the other cities with the most nonprofits. They're customers, we wanted to be close to them. And it was Boston, DC, Chicago, etc. And what we were really surprised by is the lack of density on the West Coast. And we started interviewing people, and we realized more and more that people who are deep in nonprofit philanthropy have oftentimes found that it's actually very hard to be successful on the West Coast with raising money. And that got us very surprised, right? We started at Stanford. We're all about impact. You know, there's no one who has a better mission curriculum than Stanford University. And that's one of the reasons why my co-founder and I both went to Stanford. So why is it that the ecosystem around it wasn't as strong as we expected? And my emerging hypotheses are a couple things. The first one is there's what I kind of like to call an impact haze around the West Coast, or Silicon Valley specifically, which is that many companies think of themselves as impact-oriented companies. So I've heard people at Google say I work at an impact organization, and I've heard people working at shoelace companies say that I work at an impact organization. And I think it is good, it's very good that caring about being impact forward is part of all of these organizations. But one thing that it leads to is for companies like Free Will, where we're saying our goal is to raise $1 trillion for charity, it's easy for someone to kind of see us and think like, oh, you know, they're kind of impacty like Google, which might be true, and, you know, might be a little bit different as well. And so that was very different from when we went to the East Coast and kind of saw that people were like, oh, this is very impact oriented versus this is a very commercial company and doesn't really pretend to not be a very commercial company. So that was something that was really interesting for us. And of course, obviously has to do with kind of the history around philanthropy in these places as well. And the last thing is just to say, I now firmly believe that social enterprises will work. That was not something I took for granted when I first started Free Will. I kind of thought maybe nonprofits and for-profits should be the two business models. Like, why do we need social enterprises? Maybe in between you actually get the worst of both worlds. And the thing that gives me the most conviction that it will work is talent. I think what we've seen recently is just an unprecedented flow of talent into companies like Free Will, that we're so lucky to have these folks, and we would not be able to hire them if we were just, you know, a normal for-profit company. Our retention numbers are incredible. And these folks are early employees at Squarespace and JustWorks and Mark43 and all these fancy, fast-growing New York startups. But the reason why they pick Free Will is because they're ready for their second chapter and they want it to be about impact. They feel like they've learned the skills and they want to spend it on something that's doing a lot of good for the world. And so we've seen that in spades, and I know a lot of other social enterprises will see that too. So I have a lot of optimism around social enterprises generally going forward. That's it.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much to Jenny and to all of our panelists. We'll be opening up for questions now, so please feel free to type them in the chat, and I will call on you. You can also use the tab to raise your hand, and if you can raise your hand manually, then I'll also call on you. So we have one question actually from Rosalind. Rosalind, would you like to ask your question to Jenny?
Sure. I was really intrigued with the idea, and I also understand the difference in culture between the East Coast and the West Coast. But what I was curious for her is how the enterprise itself can be financially sustainable.
Yeah, great question. So our customers are nonprofits. We support their fundraising efforts. So what that means is we'll provide them with white labeled versions of our software tools so that they can solicit and accept these types of donations online. And we also supply them with digital fundraising expertise. So we actually kind of become almost like a consulting arm to help them know how to deploy these tools well. And so we usually aim for anywhere between 20 to 50 times ROI, as in that's how much money we're getting them versus what they're paying us on an annual basis.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. And while we're waiting for other questions to come, I have a question for the panelists. So we have obviously many entrepreneurs and investors on the call today. And I know many of them, especially given a lot of what's going on in the world right now, are actively thinking about what they can do internally, particularly as it relates to questions around inclusion and impact. And so for an entrepreneur or investor who is thinking about these questions right now, do you have any advice for them as to best practices, lessons learned in terms of actively integrating into one's core business principles around inclusion and impact? And we can maybe, whoever would like to go first, but Miriam, if you'd like to share some reflections, we can go in the order maybe that the panelists spoke, and then we'll open up for some more questions.
Well, I think one of the things that I learned, frankly, from working at Google was that in the early days, it was a very diverse set of leaders. And that seemed to make all the difference in terms of being able to initially recruit diverse talent. And I think that that's one of the more underreported stories around Google's success, for example. And some of that had to do with the founding team of leaders, if you will. Out of the 13 original C-level officers and VPs, there were already 3 women in the team. There were 2 immigrants. Sergey Brin was a child of immigrants. The first CFO was Cuban American. The first general counsel was African American. And I think the teams also they tended to have a model that's been replicated quite a bit in Silicon Valley, where there was essentially a functional COO for most of the teams in the company. And that model was that often there was a externally facing man and an internally facing woman. So sorry, I think that was a very productive model. I don't think that we should be stuck in that role, and that's continued to be replicated in Silicon Valley, I think in a very unconscious way, and that women could be leading a lot of organizations, but we've seen it be a very successful strategy. And at Google, really, literally, almost every senior executive male had an internally facing COO who was literally running the day-to-day aspects of the company. And that started with Eric Schmidt and Sheryl Sandberg. On the sales side, it was Omid Korestani and Joel Bradai. On the legal side, it was David Drummond and Miriam Rivera. For Sergey Brin, it was Susan Wojcicki. And Marissa Meyer and Larry Page. I mean, just all the way down the stack of the leadership team. And obviously a lot of those women have gone on to lead organizations and or help to grow a number of really successful organizations in Silicon Valley after that. But I think that kind of the diversity and how that helped the company to grow rarely gets reported. And I think that's something that the data show is really one of the ways in which you build inclusive cultures. The Kauffman Fellows Research Center, for example, showed that if you have women on a team, that company will hire 2.5 times as many women as companies that don't start out with having women. And I think the same is very true of having ethnically diverse people. And one of the things there's been a lot of research about how gender and ethnic diversity has impacted public company returns, board diversity and its positive impact on financial returns. And we're only just beginning to get this data within the venture capital backed companies. And the Kauffman Fellows Research Center, again, used really novel research methodologies to go back and analyze 20 years worth of data on investments made in venture capital, where they used facial recognition software, where they were able to use search technologies to be able to develop pictures of the ethnic breakdown of founding teams that had received venture capital, and the gender breakdowns as well. And what we learned from that was that the ethnically diverse teams that had ethnically diverse founder teams outperformed all white teams by 30%. And that if you had, and that if you had ethnically diverse C officers, that outperformance increased to 65%. And again, BCG also did studies that showed for every dollar invested in a woman-led venture-backed company, you'd get 78 cents of profit. And for every dollar invested in a male-led company, you'd have 31 cents of profit. So again, it's like a 2.5x multiple. And I think that one of the things that we try to do is just actually make people aware of the data so that we can counter the bias. And in terms of our own decision making, we really instituted a methodology that we think helps, and we know from the studies that Spark Center has done about what are some ways in which you can reduce bias in decision making. And so one of the things is, having diversity on the team and having diversity of opinions does tend to result in better decisions. We actually screen all of our entrepreneurs using the same type of questions. And it turns out that this is really not done generally, and that, again, bias is something that people share, and that includes women share it and men share it. So when we looked at the questions that are asked of, in particular, women-led companies by VCs, and this is much more available data now because many demo days and pitch days are publicized. So you can actually go back and see what questions people asked. And for women, the downside risk questions tend to make up about 2/3 of the questions that are asked. And for men, it would be 2/3 of kind of the upside of that deal and what's the potential for growth. And the thing that happens when you ask the risk-based questions, you're already biasing both whether you'll invest and how much you'll invest. So the difference of teams that are asked risk-dominant questions versus those are asked upside questions is 8x. So that would be 2 million raised versus $16 million. So these kinds of biases in terms of methodology make a big difference in terms of what the outcome is of an investor pitch session. So we make sure to ask both upside and downside risk questions of all people to more fully inform our decision making. And we also do have clear and consistent criteria for making an investment. And guess what? We actually share our very models and all of our ideas about why something will work, won't work, what the team risks are. We just put it out there in a very transparent fashion to our entrepreneurs. And I think that also would prevent you from maybe making more biased decisions and comments. It's just the fact that you're going to actually have to justify what you say. And we constantly try to learn from our past decision making through data. So we look at things like what our pipeline is of deals that are coming in, how many of those have women, have ethnically diverse teams. Then we look at how many of them got to the next stage and actually got to one of our critical decision-making moments, which is called the market map at our firm. And then how many of them actually got funded. And we see whether there's attrition in that pipeline. And I think the more that you hold yourself to account, the less likely that you are to just make unconscious bias impact your decision. So those are some of the ways that we very actively work against bias. And by working against bias, we actually end up with a much more inclusive set of entrepreneurs.
That's super, super helpful, Miriam. Thank you so much for sharing. We have a couple of other questions that are coming through, but I wanted to give a chance if there were other panelists that wanted to share any thoughts or advice around actively promoting inclusion and impact, whether within your businesses or within investments decision-making processes.
Mehran, I had some things to share. Mehran, did you want to say anything first?
Well, I would just say, I mean, I think Miriam summed it up pretty well. I think a lot of it is what effort one puts into what you look for, right? And how you, I think, you know, Miriam did an outstanding job. She knows all the facts and numbers. And that's the thing that I think is compelling for a lot of people who are actually looking at what is my return on investment, is to actually give them the data and say, look, this is a good investment decision as well as a good social decision to get those things to align. But part of it is just, you know, where you look and how you look, right? And that's, if, you know, there's kind of these famous quotes that float around the valley. I'm not going to attribute them to particular folks, but basically, you know, people looking for particular patterns. And when you look at patterns, you just reinforce the patterns of what existed before, rather than explicitly looking for how to break those patterns, especially when you're backed by data that can lead to better results.
You.
I wanted to add a couple of things that I found effective here. And particularly, Google is one company Miriam touched on. Salesforce is one I find very interesting in this context, that since it was a very young company, they've been very explicit about codifying their mission. And to this day, they proudly proclaim that the business of business is to improve the state of the world. And they are one of the most successful companies, financially successful as well, and fast growing. And from all the way from the top, many of the executives believe that a key part of their success is very explicitly codifying their mission of improving the state of the world, which is a bit different than many corporates believe that takes away from making money. And so that is one thing I think for entrepreneurs to think about codifying. If you believe that by having impact, you can be successful, codifying that so that it's okay to talk about this. It's a belief system coming all the way from the top, but also that is recognized and appreciated. Otherwise, people may feel that having impact is kind of a second-class thing to do. It's very common in Silicon Valley, whether tech startups or big companies or other organizations. Yeah. And then the other part is the DNA. This is where kind of culturally bringing this into the DNA is very important. And here, this is an area where training could be critical, but also gender lens training. By gender lens, thinking broadly of gender as inclusivity gender lens. As Miriam was saying, we all have biases, women, men. And this is where there's a new center launching at Stanford, the Global Center for Gender Equality, which is looking explicitly at this, and I've been involved from the early days, and looking at how to work with organizations, including companies, to bring this kind of thinking into the DNA and the culture. Not only women, all men, everyone goes through gender lens training and inclusivity training so that we view the world with a different frame. And the belief there is, it's more not, it's just different frame we are looking at things from. If we can shift the frame slightly, it could really bring positive change. And I love panels like this. As the other area that I would completely agree with Miriam, that we need representation at the top levels and visible representation, not just executives and panelists, but visible ones. And this is why I love this panel. I was joking with someone that there's the industry thinking that at least have one woman and one person of color or ethnicity on a panel. And I was saying that we have only one white, and that too kind of Jenna is kind of quite a mix, and we have only one man on the panel, and we have about 6 or 7 ethnicities among us. I love panels like this. I think this is what is needed, to Miriam's point, that diversity automatically fixes these problems to some degree, diversity at the top at every level. Just wanted to share that.
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you so much, Radhika. Jenny, would you like to add anything on this?
Nope.
Brilliant. So Algernon, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Recently, I feel like there's been a surge in entrepreneurs that believe they need to seek venture capital money, although they might not have what are commonly believed to be venture scale ideas, okay? They might be good business ideas. To your point, they might be small to medium-sized business ideas that can employ a lot of people at scale, but there's such a sort of a popularity around the idea of pitching and getting quote unquote VC money. I feel like a lot of entrepreneurs are, honestly, they may not even understand what venture scale opportunity really means. And so my question is, are you seeing this, and how do you deal with, you know, enthusiastic entrepreneurs of all varieties diverse or otherwise, that might not have the right perspective about aligning opportunity with the right kind of capital.
Thank you. Thank you. Who would like to take that question first?
I can kind of take a shot at that. I think that one, that may be more true now, and in many ways it's a fallout of even the Great Recession and the number of banks that have closed throughout the country, and community banks that used to be a source of financing. And then really the lack of innovation in terms of business financing in our country. And I know I serve as a trustee of the Kauffman Foundation in Kansas City, and we're trying to help create new models for how to finance business in the country, because you're right, very few companies really have what is a venture scalable idea. And again, one statistic around that is only 1% of companies are public companies in the United States. And about 43% of those were venture-backed companies. So, the purpose of venture capital is to create extreme scale businesses on that order. And I think that it's very difficult for people to really understand, what you're talking about when you talk about venture scale, because, even a business that's on the outside designed to grow into, maximum $100 million business is not a venture backable business. A venture backable business is one that can have the scale to grow to be $1 billion in valuation, and then $1 billion in revenue, and plus, and multiple billions. And so,
yes,
I think that that's really one of the things that is really difficult, is that there needs to be a continuum of capital formation in our country that really does have different return profiles and different methods for growing companies. And so one model that the Kauffman Foundation is supporting is models that are based around revenue repayment of loans, with some warrants, et cetera, for businesses that have the prospect to be successful, but are not going to have that kind of return. And I certainly think that in terms of small business loans, for example, through the SBA, there just needs to be a lot more automation, a lot greater reduction in complexity for small business owners to apply for those kinds of loans. And I think that we need to have mechanisms of enablement for those kind of government loans to actually reach their target market. And some of the programs that I've seen around this would be, for example, having volunteer accountants that actually help a small business to be able to apply. And we need to make those kinds of things much more scalable and available to business owners who have different return profiles to be able to access capital. But we're seeing newer models that are based on revenue lending as opposed to traditional venture capital.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else who would like to offer any thoughts on that from the panel?
I'll add a couple of things, having been an angel investor for a while. I think this is a shift a little bit. And I think part of it could also be that, especially in places like Silicon Valley, Stanford community, people are very enamored with venture capital as well. And to Miriam's point, if it's not the right match, it's actually a misfit. Because if you're not that kind of company that's going to scale to be that next giant public company, you might be increasing your odds of failing by aligning with the wrong partner. And this is an example where Casper.ai that I mentioned earlier, it's an interesting company, Stanford Angels funded company, and with innovative tech. And when they came to us, the one condition was, they said, I don't want any venture capital, the entrepreneur said. I'll only take angel money, which is rare, but because he understood this dynamic that Miriam talked about. But part of it is people not understanding that one. I also want to mention that for entrepreneurs who are looking at a double bottom line, impact and mission-driven entrepreneurs, It can be more challenging at times because the classic foundations often only fund NGOs other than a few. Some of the traditional investors don't want to fund. But this is an area where catalytic philanthropy is stepping in a little bit. So to the degree that you're an entrepreneur with a mission to a positive impact, then also heard about the Kaufman and some of the points Miriam mentioned, the Rockefeller Foundation, Gates is coming in sometimes with initial capital in a manner that allows you to take investment later. And then there is the whole impact investing community that Jenna, you yourself are very much part of. Perhaps you might share stepping out of your moderator role for a second of how that community is an asset to entrepreneurs.
Sure. Happy to share. And then we have a few more questions that I want to make sure we get in the last 15 minutes that we have here. I definitely think this idea that not all companies should raise venture capital funding is a really important one. And the idea, and exactly as Miriam was talking about in terms of some of the structures that the Kaufman Foundation, how they structure investments. I think sometimes like debt is the best form of capital. The ability to be able to also think about, depending on what industry one is working in and where the capital needs are and what one's goals are in terms of scaling. Like there are some businesses that make sense to be more lifestyle businesses, and that being able to identify sources of capital that might be more patient, depending on how you're thinking about the growth and trajectory of the business. So thinking about, and actually Miriam's on the advisory board for, but the Acumen Fund, for example, where they very much sort of think about this lens around patient capital, and it's just often looking at discretion, like concessionary returns, because of the types of businesses that they're investing in, and particularly some of the geographies that they're investing in. And so being able to have that type of capital as being really helpful. So I think it's as part of this broader conversation in those early days as entrepreneurs are raising capital, being able to think about more of that matchmaking to ensure there's an alignment between how the investors are thinking about things and how the entrepreneurs are also approaching problem solving. So I would love to, I'm not sure if I'm saying your name right, but Carrie Maitre, I think you have a question, and so I'd love to give you an opportunity to ask, and then we'll go over to Keith and then to Aisha. So Carrie Maitre.
Hello, can you hear me? Am I muted, unmuted?
Great.
You're hearing me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So anyway, I just had a small comment to offer. So I was at Stanford Medical School in the 80s and 90s, graduated in the late 80s, and I did my residency there. And in this, so I actually was there during the time of the Bakke decision, when there was a lot of conflict over affirmative action and the value of diversity and that sort of thing. The word diversity hadn't been invented yet. And my background, I'm from Detroit, Michigan, African American. But prior to Stanford, I went to Harvard. And one of the things that I brought to the table was to let people know I'm not particularly representative of African Americans from Detroit because of the experiences that I have. So simply having me on the panel doesn't necessarily give you or whoever an African American viewpoint per se. If somebody really wants to dig deep into the more significant levels of unempowerment or that sort of thing, sometimes we have to step beyond our own considerations of the categories of things like white, black, Asian, and all of that, and really recognize that probably everybody on this phone call, I have more in common with you, especially after living on the West Coast for 25 years, than I do with African Americans in Michigan. And one of the speakers, I think he's a professor, mentioned a conversation with a mayor or a governor, some elected official in Tennessee, and how that person was interested in education for Tennessee. So these are like ethnic subcultures that get glossed over by the statistical categories of black, white, et cetera, et cetera. And so somebody black or white from Tennessee are going to be very different perhaps from somebody black or white from California. And so the other thing, there was, as far as the computer sciences and statistics, in order to reach beyond our own sameness and to reach into this deeper, richer aspects of diversity within our own categories, it's often important to recognize some of the things that have made people feel unempowered. And we all have histories of success and continued success in order to be where we are. And it takes a certain amount of optimism to follow that path as a person of color, as a person from a disadvantaged background, regardless of their race, as a woman who doesn't necessarily have role models in her own family or community, all sorts of different situations. And to dig a little bit deeper into recognizing that often the statistics themselves and how they're processed by people like us add to a certain disadvantage. I do clinical trials research, and often in that space, for instance, women are eliminated from clinical trials unless it's federally mandated for expediency, because women present all sorts of, let's call it physiologic diversity that you don't have with males, to the point where even Premarin, the clinical trial on estrogen replacement, the early trials were done on male subjects. So part of it is to look at ourselves, and some people mention intrinsic bias, and how we can loosen that and not repeat some of the generational errors.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing those reflections. It's such an important lens and perspective to the conversation. So thank you for joining and sharing. And I want to make sure that we have an opportunity. Keith, I know you've had your hand up for a while, but do you have a question that you'd like to ask?
Yep. So just wanted to say thanks for the Stanford Angels and Entrepreneurs family and Impact Experience, and Jenna and everybody on the team for putting this webinar together. So just in terms of the social innovation and kind of social enterprise kind of space, whether it was related to trying to find more innovation inside of finance, as Miriam was describing, or even some of the early work that we had done a couple of years ago in the beginnings of the Catalytic Finance Initiative, when Professor Singleton and we got together for that first roundtable, to really listen to him talk about how he would share changes with curriculum for first-year MBA students, so they'd look at a business model from a fashion of, well, how is that going to better humanity? And that through that lens, that was going to shape the direction of where that business would go. Well, that's an educational imperative. But the other imperative, which is crucial because those are future entrepreneurs and business leaders, but the other imperative is, beyond industry, hopefully they start to look at it less as a check the box. And as some of us know, that it's being looked at as social impact and social enterprise is much more of a directed business model that actually makes money. But more importantly, in some respects, is back to where all these biases or images have come from. And they've really come from media. And so I think that one place that we want to continue to look at to sort of bring the industry that are the message makers to the table to assist us with this kind of continued, deeply important work is folks that tell those stories, whether it's news, whether it's television, whether it's media, because otherwise we're kind of rolling a rock up a hill, because it's really hard to change beliefs. Data is crucial, clearly, but the beliefs come from other places other than academic work oftentimes. And we want to utilize those systems that really can help to sort of change the narrative for folks and their own belief system. So that's a combination of data, and then data that gets enlivened, and it gets enlivened through media and through other kinds of storytelling and other kinds of messaging. And so I just hope that as we keep moving forward, we can look to sort of gain those allies to help us push this message of all this wonderful work that we're all engaged in and believe in, for the betterment of all of us.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much, Keith, for sharing that. And I know we have just about 5 minutes left. So I wanted to make sure Aisha had a chance to share her question, and then would love any sort of closing comments and reflections from the panel would be fantastic. So Aisha, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks so much, Jenna. So as a person who's trying to launch the South Florida group of the Stanford Angels and Entrepreneurs, what do any of the panelists or anyone on this call think that we can do as an organization to try to bring more of this diversity, and then also how can we help entrepreneurs, you know, really achieve their goals of creating these businesses that maybe aren't going to be venture suitable, but will still be productive and continue to push the envelope and, you know, employ people in our communities, which is always a great thing. So anyone that has thoughts on that, I'd love to hear what you think we can do with our platform here.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Who would like to share any reflections on the last few comments? Miriam, would you like to start?
Well, I was going to say, I think, Keith, you've been involved in starting the new chapter in LA, and maybe some of your comments here would be really apropos.
Again, I think it comes back to messaging. Some would say that's education, exposure, and all of those kinds of things. But it comes back to you know, whether or not people see folks that look like them in positions that have are of leadership, whether they see stories where they can reflect upon, you know, that being something that they believe in. I recall a little bit of what I think it was Jenny was describing about some of her belief systems as a woman and as an Asian woman in terms of how she viewed herself and didn't know that that was her that her partner was talking about. And so I think that related to, I believe, Aisha's question, is that we want to assist in how the stories are being told, not just externally, but how those stories are even told to ourselves. And so, you know, we have a kind of a direct line to another club, besides just a lot of personal relationships inside of the entertainment space down in Southern California, which again was another reason for us to sort of spread out and try and bring those different kinds of industries into the greater Stanford Angel Entrepreneur ecosystem. But there's a Stanford Entertainment group that we often do kind of joint events with. And so what I've been trying to say is that we want to use those resources to help us with all that kind of messaging, the kind that Aisha had talked about, as well as for the kind of greater look in terms of what you know, what these opportunities are in the social innovation space. So I'll go back to that. It's the messaging, especially now. People have been cocooning for 4 or 5 months, and everybody's just, you know, consuming media, and whether it's, you know, on their MacBooks or or elsewhere. So that's a place that I think that we should challenge. As a matter of fact, it's more of a challenge. There will be allies, but we want to challenge them to do better in that way.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much, Keith. Other thoughts, reflections from others on the panel?
I'll add to that a bit that on the Keith's point, and Alicia, Alicia, sorry, Aisha, that I think this is a moment perhaps to look at this in collaboration. We also have Paula Mariwala on the call, I believe, at least she was a few minutes ago, started the India chapter. And so these will be good people for you to talk with. Aisha, of course, we're happy to chat. But to the point that's being raised about non-venture kind of capital and for impact-driven entrepreneurs. In fact, the roundtables Keith's mentioning, Jenna and I had started, we did, and Miriam was very involved, a couple of roundtables around thought leadership in impact investing and having societal impact. We kind of put them on hold. But maybe this is a moment to revisit or at least think about what is it perhaps we could do collectively as Stanford clubs on that one. And perhaps, Miriam, we could discuss at some point what role or shape that could take. But I'm seeing that so many questions are coming up around that. This is the one that Ken Singleton's quite interested in as well. And what is it that the Stanford community could offer to entrepreneurs who are not really the venture capital traditional ones? And also beyond that, what could be some of the thought leadership? I think it's an interesting moment. COVID is making us rethink everything. So Keith, thanks for raising that. We'd love to, offline, you, Aisha, others, Miriam, perhaps we could, Jenna, maybe we would coordinate a call to brainstorm what we could do. And I wanted to also, on the first question, the one around, Kenmaitre, sorry if I'm saying your name wrong, The very good point raised. And I have recently been thinking a lot about what is a privilege. Just because I'm a woman doesn't mean that I can step in the shoes of a woman who doesn't have role models, mentors. And in this spirit, I would encourage us all to read a recent call to action by one of my heroes, the very inspiring head of the Ford Foundation, Darren Walker, who looks at exactly these issues. He's done a call to action to every human being to examine our own privilege, which, as he says, comes in so many forms and shapes and much more nuanced than the ethnicity and skin color. And to kind of understand it and understand what we are willing to give up there. So I think this is a topic to be discussed. Perhaps it's even a topic to have a separate panel on like this. What does it mean to examine our privilege? I loved how much we went deep into bias here. Perhaps privilege is another area to go into. And so thank you for raising that point.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Radhika. Any other closing comments from anybody else on the panel before we wrap up today? And thank you so much again for all of you for being here and for everyone for engaging. Alexa has shared in the chat a survey that we would love if everyone was able to fill out, just your reflections on your time today and any advice and thoughts for future events that we might host. So any other closing comments from the panel?
I would just say that, this is actually a real time of innovation and capital formation, because one, there is impact capital that does have sometimes different expectations of return. And, that's one reason why I sit on the Acumen Fund investment committee as a volunteer, is because I do think that there are both ideas and the experience of being an entrepreneur and working on a problem is such an important part of like being able to learn and build scalable businesses. And so even if it's not a venture backable idea, there are many great innovations that are being done by social entrepreneurs that should receive investment. In addition, the crowdfunding platforms that many of us know, under the Jobs Act, the administration permitted Reg A kinds of public filings that now allow companies to go directly to the public to raise capital in new ways that didn't exist a few years ago. And some of our companies in our portfolio are taking advantage of that approach versus continuing to raise venture capital. And so I do think that there is more innovation than there's been for a long time. And I think that gives entrepreneurs hopefully an opportunity to develop different models. I know at the business school, there were even some professors who would back students in buying existing companies that they could then grow that were obviously not venture backable businesses, but have become really successful businesses. And there are plenty of businesses started the old-fashioned way where they earn and grow organically, and a lot of those businesses do become very successful businesses and also even public companies. So there are pathways, I think, that are available, and we need to just be aware that there are different forms of capital that are probably going to be more useful to different kinds of entrepreneurs, and that we want to keep on innovating in this area because it's what creates more companies and more jobs. And entrepreneurship has actually been declining in the United States for the last 30 years. And that has been declining in particular communities as well. And I think that we need to ensure that we keep the engine of growth in the economy going with small businesses and businesses that can grow, but maybe are not venture backable.
Yeah, thank you so much, Miriam. Miran or Jenny, any closing comments? Okay, well, brilliant. Well, thank you.
Thanks to everyone.
Same.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much to everybody. And yeah, looking forward to staying in touch and hopefully seeing you at the next event. And thank you so much to Alexa and to the Stanford team for also helping to make all of this so smooth on the back end as well. So thank you. Thank you, Alexa and Tom.
Thank you to you, Jenna, for being such an awesome moderator as always.
Thank you. Appreciate your time.